Welcome to Deep Psyche. Not all pain cries out. Some wounds choose silence. Others harden into quiet strength. And some people, those who've carried too much for too long, have learned to smile just enough so no one will ask. But beneath the calm, behind the coldness, under the armor of fierce independence, there's always a story. Carl Jung once warned us, pain that isn't understood doesn't go away. It sinks deeper. It becomes behavior. And the tragedy? Almost no one notices. They don't ask. They judge. In this video, you'll discover the 12 hidden traits of those who've suffered silently, those who often behave in ways even they don't fully understand. And more importantly, you'll learn how to turn silent pain into something else, into awareness, into choice, into healing. Because some scars aren't on the skin. They live in the way someone flinches from kindness, or takes too long to trust, or disappears even in a room full of people. Some wounds don't leave marks, but they shape everything. Old pain doesn't announce itself. It becomes a way of being. It becomes silence where there should be words, distance where there used to be closeness, tiredness that sleep can't fix. Carl Jung called trauma a psychic wound, one that, when ignored, keeps bleeding inside. But he also believed that wound could become a path, not to erase what happened, but to transform what still lingers like a threat. Because when pain is finally seen, fully heard, it stops being a sentence. It becomes awareness. The trouble is, almost no one teaches us how to listen to pain. The world doesn't ask us to feel, it asks us to perform. So those who've suffered too much, too young, learn to adapt. They build masks, take shortcuts through emotion, and disappear behind perfectly crafted roles. And life goes on. Sometimes they even laugh. But something inside stays braced, always ready, as if one wrong word might tear open what barely managed to close. You might see yourself in this, or perhaps someone you love, someone who suddenly makes more sense. But this isn't about diagnosing anyone. It's about embracing them, with more empathy, more presence, and above all, with less guilt. Because no behavior is random. No trait appears without a history. So if at any point this touches a nerve, if your breath catches or your chest tightens, it's okay. It's just your soul recognizing something it never had the words for. And that moment of recognition, that's already healing. Some people learned early that needing is dangerous, that asking opens the door to disappointment, that relying on others is a shortcut to pain. And so, the psyche responded. It made them strong, decisive, unbreakable. But inside, they're exhausted. Carl Jung spoke of the false self, a mask the ego builds when being real feels too risky. It protects, yes, but it also isolates. They become used to carrying everything alone, and slowly the world believes they can, but no one should have to. So the first hidden trait of those who've suffered too much? Hyper-independence. It looks like maturity. It even earns applause. But it's not strength, it's a scar, impressive from afar. Heavy is let up close. They won't ask for help, but they need it. They won't show pain, but they feel it, deep, often wordless. They may not even remember what it feels like to trust without fear. And this rigidity seeps into everything, love. Friendship, work, everything becomes performance. Everything becomes control. But it comes at a price. The chest tightens. A simple touch feels like a threat. Rest feels like weakness. And even in a crowd, they feel alone. Because hyper-independence isn't freedom. It's a locked room, built for safety, but lived in like a cell. They're not trying to be difficult. They're trying not to be left behind again. But deep down, it's just another way of being silently wounded. The second trait? Excessive empathy. At first glance, it looks like a gift, and often it is. But when empathy becomes a survival skill, it stops being compassion and starts becoming a defense. Some people, even as children, learned to scan the room like a storm was coming. They picked up on tension in a voice, a glance, a silence. They felt for others before they even knew how to feel for themselves. This sensitivity wasn't born of peace. It came from necessity, from trying to predict the next outburst, from the desperate hope of keeping the house calm, even if it meant losing their own voice. Jung called it projection, when we unconsciously place onto others what we haven't yet dared to face within ourselves. And those who feel too much for others, they often carry what they were never allowed to feel for themselves. They're trying, without even realizing it, to soothe in others a pain they've never been allowed to tend in themselves. They become the dependable one, the fixer, the always available shoulder. But behind all the giving is a quiet kind of depletion. Because those who feel for everyone almost always forget to feel for themselves, too much empathy can look noble, and sometimes it is, but sometimes it's a form of evasion, a way to bypass their own wounds, to stay outward-facing, because turning inward feels like facing a tidal wave alone. And worse, this kind of empathy often creates unbalanced connections, where one person gives and the other just receives, where listening becomes a mask to avoid ever being heard, where being useful is the only way to feel seen. That's when empathy stops being love and starts becoming a shield. A beautiful shield maybe, but a shield all the same, because deep down that hypersensitivity began as survival. Someone once had to predict emotions just to feel safe. But now it's no longer necessary. Maybe real empathy finally means turning all that tender attentiveness inward, listening to your own needs, honoring your own pain. And that leads us to the third hidden trait of those who've suffered too much: fear of real intimacy. Not because they don't feel, quite the opposite. They feel everything, but they hold back. They love in pieces. They offer closeness, but with caution. They observe before they open. They wait. Even when they trust, there's always one part of themselves they keep sealed away. A hidden room no one gets to enter. And beneath that hesitation, there's a whisper. Be careful. This could hurt again. And it could. Because when someone was betrayed right at the place they most needed safety, opening up stopped being natural. It started feeling dangerous. The memory of abandonment is louder than the presence of love. Affection shows up, but fear comes with it, hand in hand. Jung spoke of unconscious complexes, patterns buried so deep, they hijack the present without our consent. In relationships, this shows up as jealousy that feels too big, withdrawal that happens too fast, walls that go up even when no one's attacking. But behind those reactions, there's almost always a younger self, a child still echoing with the pain of being left when they finally dared to trust. So on the outside, this person might look confident, maybe even proud of their independence. They'll say things like, "I don't need anyone," or "I do better on my own." But inside, there's a quiet ache, a hunger to be truly seen, held, accepted. And every time someone gets too close, that longing resurfaces, not as hope, but as fear. It wears masks: control, moodiness, distance, irritation. Because real intimacy demands presence. It asks us to be seen fully. But for someone who's been hurt before, that level of visibility feels like exposure, like standing in a spotlight while waiting for the arrow. So love, instead of being a home, becomes a battlefield. Not a place of rest, but a place of defense. If you love someone like this, patience will be your greatest offering. And if you are someone like this, know this: you don't need to rush. But maybe, just maybe, the past doesn't have to keep writing the present. That realization alone, that the present can be different, that's the beginning of healing. Not all love hurts. Not every closeness is a hidden goodbye. Sometimes it's just someone trying to stay, quietly, sincerely. But if you've suffered enough, you might not believe that at first. How many times have you heard, "You're so strong," and you smiled, nodded, said thank you like it was a compliment, but no one saw what happened later? The tears you wiped alone, the weight that never lifted, the night that swallowed you again. Some people became symbols of strength simply because they were never given another option. When the world collapses too early, you either hold it up yourself or get buried under it. So the body learns to rise each morning, even when the soul just wants to disappear. That's the fourth trait of those who've suffered too much. The persona of strength, who breaks down in secret. The outside, calm, poised, reliable. But underneath is an exhaustion so deep it no longer has a name. Because admitting fatigue feels like failure. And pain is too dangerous to show. Carl Jung called it the persona, the social mask we create to face the world. But sometimes the mask stops being a tool and becomes a wall, permanent, heavy. The person forgets what it means to feel because they're too busy being what everyone else needs. And that strength, so admired, becomes a silent prison. No one asks if they're okay, because everyone assumes they always are. But no one should carry everything all the time. That's not strength. That's quiet survival. What looks like balance is often just containment. What looks like discipline is often fear of unraveling. And so life turns into this, holding it all together on the surface while slowly coming undone beneath it. And when the breakdown comes, it's not dramatic. It's quiet, in the shower, behind the wheel, on the pillow at 2 a.m. No one notices, because the performance has been too perfect for too long. But real strength, it's not about being unshakable. It's about being honest enough to say, today is hard, and trusting that someone will simply be there, not to fix, not to judge, just to stay. That's when the armor starts to loosen. The fifth trait of those who've suffered deeply is sensory sensitivity. Loud sounds feel like violence. Bright lights sting. Crowds drain every last drop of energy. The mind wants to stay composed, but the body remembers everything. The heart races, the breath shortens. The impulse to escape arrives, uninvited and unexplained. It's not overreacting. It's not being fragile. It's what happens when the nervous system has lived too long in survival mode. Because somewhere in the past, danger came unannounced. And the body adapted by staying ready, always ready. Carl Jung once said, "What we do not bring to consciousness appears in our lives as fate." In the case of trauma, it reappears through the body. The body speaks what the soul still can't articulate. This sensitivity, it's not just a wound, it's also a kind of radar, a deep awareness, a capacity to feel the world in ways others can't. But it's exhausting too, because everything is stimulus. Every tone, every room, every silence feels magnified. Others won't always understand why a party felt suffocating, why a small sound triggered panic, why you left early, sat in the dark, or needed a day to recover. But for those who live it, it's real and constant and consuming. Still, when this trait is met with compassion, with self-awareness, it can become something else. A gift, a doorway, a capacity to sense, to notice, to care with incredible depth. But only if the one who feels first learns to listen to themselves. Many people with this trait are intuitive, perceptive, deeply aware. But when this sensitivity is rooted in old wounds, it stops being a gift and becomes a burden. The body turns into a silent battlefield, reacting to threats the conscious mind has long forgotten, but the soul still remembers. Healing begins not by silencing these reactions, but by listening to them, by understanding that discomfort is not weakness, it is memory. Sometimes what feels like an overreaction is just a long-buried cry asking to be heard. Not every discomfort is random. Some are echoes of a time when the world felt too unsafe, too loud, too much. The sixth trait of those who've suffered too much is the obsessive need for control. And this control is rarely about power, it's about fear. Fear of chaos, fear of being caught unprepared, fear of losing everything again. At some point, life overwhelmed them, and they learned that control, even if exhausting, feels safer than surrender. So they plan, they prepare, they hold on tight. Outwardly, it looks like reliability, responsibility, perfection. But inside, there's a storm. Rest never comes easily, because even in stillness, the mind keeps racing. What if? What if? What if? Carl Jung said the ego will try to manage exactly what the unconscious refuses to feel. Control then becomes a wall built brick by brick against helplessness, a fortress to keep out unpredictability, a way to never feel that kind of powerlessness again. But life is not meant to be controlled. It's meant to be lived. And living, truly living, requires trust. Not blind trust, but a gentle openness to the unknown. Healing doesn't mean giving up all control at once. It means beginning to believe, little by little, that maybe not everything needs to be predicted to be okay. Letting go of control is like finally turning off the lights in a room you used to sleep in with everything on because the dark once scared you. At first, it's unsettling. Then perhaps it becomes peace. And peace doesn't always come with noise, movement, or people. Sometimes real relief arrives when everything quiets down. That's the seventh trait of those who've suffered too much. Silence as refuge. Not avoidance, not coldness, but a need for space, a pause, a soft room inside where the soul can quietly rearrange itself. And that silence can be misunderstood. Those who thrive on noise and connection may not understand why someone prefers the quiet, shorter conversations, less presence. But for those who've lived through storms, silence is not emptiness, it is repair. Jung recognized the symbolic value of retreat. He understood withdrawal not as weakness, but as a sacred psychic process, a cycle of death and rebirth. When the world becomes too much, the soul instinctively pulls back, not out of apathy, but out of a need to protect what still feels raw, like someone shielding a wound, not to push people away, but to let something fragile breathe. Silence in this space is more than the absence of sound. It's the absence of pressure, judgment, noise, and performance. It's where the masks fall away, where nothing has to be explained, where pain is allowed to exist, quietly, without an audience, without a deadline for healing. But over time, silence that began as medicine can harden into a wall. What once healed becomes habit, and slowly, what was a pause turns into a prison. That's the risk, because silence, while soothing, can also turn into solitude. And solitude, if left too long, can become invisibility. This is why this trait, the retreat into quiet, requires tenderness. Not everyone who grows silent is at peace. Sometimes they're just too tired to keep translating their pain into something the world can understand. The way forward is holding space, allowing the quiet to exist without guilt, without interrogation, but also knowing when to gently knock, to open a crack in the door, to remind them, yes, silence can be home, but even homes need windows and a way back out. Have you ever noticed how "I trust you" sounds simple, but for someone who was hurt while trusting, those words feel like walking a tightrope? The eighth trait of those who've suffered too much is a heart overly guarded. Not because it doesn't want to love, but because the last time it opened, it broke. And the break left a mark. Now the ego stands guard, not out of arrogance, but out of survival. Love doesn't just walk in anymore. It goes through filters. Every word gets weighed, every silence analyzed. Every delay between messages reads like a warning. It's not that they don't feel, it's that they feel too much. And feeling too much, unprotected, once hurt like hell. Now love arrives, but it's met with caution, a guarded tenderness, a subtle fear behind each smile. For both people, the one who protects and the one who stays, it's exhausting. Because real love needs flow, and flow can't happen if everything must first pass through gates of suspicion. Jung spoke of the difference between living from fear and living from trust. Here, fear still holds the steering wheel. Even when all is well, some voice inside whispers, "Don't relax." This could vanish too. The unconscious hasn't caught up. It still fights old battles, still prepares for ghosts that no longer exist. Even when the present is kind, the past keeps its hand on the trigger. But distrust, meant to protect, can also suffocate. It can block the very thing it longs for, a love that's deep, real, enduring. Because connection always carries risk, always asks for some form of surrender. And here's the irony. Those who guard their hearts the most are often those who love the deepest, who crave the softest kind of affection, but who are also most afraid of reliving that old pain, Overprotection becomes its own wound. Maybe the answer isn't to tear the walls down, but to open them just a little, to test, to offer small trust, to take a breath and say, I'm scared, but I'll try. Not all at once, but one step, then another. Because maybe, just maybe this time, love isn't here to harm, it's here to stay. The ninth trait of those who've suffered too much, a sense of justice sharpened by pain. It doesn't come from books or from stirring speeches. It comes from lived experience, from standing in the ruins of betrayal, from being silenced, from reaching out for protection that never came. A soul that has been crushed by injustice learns to sense it from far away and refuses to let it pass unnoticed. Even the faintest sign of disrespect lights a fire from an old wound. And even when the current moment seems safe, the body reacts swiftly, fiercely, as defense, but also as memory. Jung understood emotional complexes ignite when the present brushes against an injury the past left behind. This burning sense of justice is often born from such an injury. It is the mark of someone who once had no voice and now refuses silence. To outsiders, this reaction can seem like overreacting, too intense, too much. But it's not drama, it's the psyche standing its ground, saying, not this time I will not swallow it. This moral sensitivity often emerges early. Children who saw wrongs they couldn't fix, teenagers who challenged unfair rules, adults who take up causes with a fire that's really an attempt to protect the wounded child within. The archetype at play is the moral warrior, the one who fights not for perfection, but for coherence, for respect, for the right to be treated with dignity. When this fight is balanced, it's beautiful, noble, a voice of clarity in a chaotic world. But when it's led only by pain, it can harden into rigidity, into intolerance. The challenge is this: to preserve the fire of justice without letting it burn everything around it. To know how to wield the sword, but also when to lower it, when to listen, when to soften. Because those who've known injustice intimately also know how much it wounds. And for that very reason, they hold the rare power to do things differently, to be the kind of strength that protects without punishing, to fight but without losing themselves in the war. Those who carry the sword of justice see what others don't, not just the wrongs in the world, but the hidden hurts in people. Pain sharpens perception. It trains the eyes to see the tremble in a smile, to hear the quietness behind words. They become people who can feel someone's sorrow even when it's wrapped in laughter, who can hold space without demanding an explanation, who simply know and stay. The 10th trait of those who've suffered too much, the ability to see the invisible in others. It's as if pain has tuned their senses, made their soul more alert, more open, more able to recognize where sadness hides, even when it's buried under a smile. This isn't magic, it's memory, memory stored in the bones, the kind that remembers the shape of loneliness, the silence of grief, the weight of not being seen. This kind of perception isn't something you learn. It awakens after the fall. Those who've cried silently know how to listen between the words. Those who've felt invisible in a crowded room can spot that same loneliness in another. It's instinctive. Jung once said, as we integrate our own pain, we begin to recognize the pain of the collective. This is exactly that, a sort of emotional radar that doesn't demand attention, but quietly activates when needed. And sometimes it makes all the difference. This sensitivity may seem soft, but it carries weight, because seeing what no one else sees comes with responsibility. And often those who feel so deeply for others forget to care for themselves. They absorb, they hold, they give, and they disappear. The key is balance, to stand with someone in their sorrow without losing yourself in it, to witness pain without carrying it all on your back. This ability to perceive the invisible is a gift, but also a reminder. Pain, when met with awareness, becomes a kind of wisdom, a presence that supports without suffocating, a quiet touch that says, I see you. Even when the world is rushing past, Those with this trait notice the truth in the small things, the way someone sits, the delay before they speak, the "I'm fine" that doesn't quite land, and only someone who's been through it knows what that really means. But seeing people so clearly comes with a cost, because while reading others' expressions, tones, silences, a whisper rises inside. What if you're the burden? The 11th trait of those who've suffered too much, a deep, quiet fear of being a burden. It's a subtle ache, but constant, a kind of silent shame for existing with all your needs, your feelings, your messiness. People with this fear rarely say it out loud, but it echoes in every attempt to shrink themselves, in every unnecessary apology, in every "I'm okay" spoken just to not trouble anyone. This fear often begins in childhood, when emotions were dismissed or punished, when "stop crying," "don't be dramatic," or quiet indifference taught them their feelings were too much. So the adult they become is kind, responsible, helpful, but always afraid of taking up space, afraid that their presence, their sadness, their needs might inconvenience someone. They feel guilty for needing help. They feel like they should earn their right to lean on someone. Jung called this unconscious guilt, a deep wound the ego shapes itself around. And this wound whispers, "You are only worthy if you don't get in the way." So they apologize for everything, soften every pain, diminish every need. Sometimes even love feels uncomfortable, as if they've stolen it from someone more deserving. Living like this is like walking while trying not to leave footprints, breathing as if they need permission. But the truth is, you do not need to apologize for existing. Needing is human. Being tired is human. And so is being vulnerable. Recognizing that fear is already a step toward healing. Because once you begin to believe that taking up space isn't a crime, but a right, something shifts. The soul straightens, the air becomes lighter. Life stops feeling like something you have to earn just to be allowed in. You don't need to justify your presence. You don't need to shrink to be loved. You, just as you are enough. And even with all that fear, your soul still finds beauty in a warm cup of coffee, in someone saying good morning when no one else did, in a quiet "did you get home safe?" Because those who've lost a lot learn to cherish the smallest gestures. And that is where healing begins to smile. In the light through the window at dusk, in the sound of rain, in the gentle rhythm of a heart learning, maybe I'm not too much. Maybe I'm just human. The 12th trait of those who've suffered too much, the ability to cherish the little things. It's not about romanticizing pain. It's about what pain leaves behind. When life has fallen apart, when everything you relied on crumbled, you begin to notice what remains, and the small no longer feels small. A quiet morning, a familiar scent, a voice that says, "I'm here." They become symbols, not of what's missing, but of what still exists. Those who've been shattered learn to notice beauty where others rush past. Their soul acquires a kind of still gratitude, not for the suffering itself, but for what it revealed, for the pause that followed, for the softness that returned, for the presence that once felt impossible. Carl Jung spoke of the wise one, the archetype that emerges after facing the shadow, the one who returns not stronger, but gentler. You see it in how they move. They don't need much to feel, and when they feel fully. They cry at a song because it finds the place no one else sees. They smile at the way the light touches a wall. They thank you, not politely but deeply, for a gesture most wouldn't even notice. And some mistake this for fragility, but it's not. It's depth. It's the wisdom that only comes after loss. The ability to appreciate the little things isn't just a trait. It's a quiet defiance, a refusal to become numb. It's what happens when you've known what it's like to lose everything and still choose to see beauty before it's gone. And then comes the final trait, the 13th, the need for purpose after pain. Surviving isn't enough. The soul, having endured, wants to know why. It begins to search for meaning, to turn pain into path. It doesn't look like a grand mission. Often it's something simple, but it's true. Helping someone who's in the place you once were. Offering comfort, creating, teaching, listening. Just being the presence you once needed and didn't have. Because pain, when endured consciously, wants to become offering. Jung called this individuation when we stop being prisoners of our past and start becoming ourselves. Not in reaction to pain, but in dialogue with it. That's when the soul begins to walk differently. Less concerned with appearances, more aligned with truth. It's not that the pain disappears, it doesn't. It lingers as memory, as scar. But it no longer commands, now it points, now it guides. Those who carry this trait look back and realize, even when broken, they kept going. Even in the dark, they still reached out. And even without knowing how, they turned pain into presence, and presence into purpose. And no, they are not role models, not examples of strength. They're simply people who chose to live, not despite the pain, but alongside it. And from that choice, life begins again, not as it was, but as it was meant to become. In the end, perhaps that's what suffering gives us. Not just wounds, but the wisdom to walk through the world more awake, to love more quietly, to see more deeply, to feel what others miss. Carl Jung once said, "Only the wounded physician heals." Maybe that's who we become after pain. Wounded, yes, but also awake, capable of turning shadows into light and sorrow into soul. If any part of this spoke to you, if you saw yourself in these words, know that you're not alone. Thank you for being here, for listening with your heart. If you found meaning in this, please consider sharing it with someone who might need it too. And if you'd like to keep walking this path with me, you can like, subscribe, and join us in the next video. Until then, may your pain guide you gently toward your purpose. And may your presence, quiet, honest, real, continue to light the way.